University of York. My name is Helena Cox. I am the University Art Curator, and tonight I am here to chair this amazing session with our wonderful guests. It is my great pleasure indeed to welcome you to this evening's event, which forms part of the University of York's Open Lecture Series, and it's so wonderful to see so many of you here. Tonight's event will be a conversation about the British Museum's landmark exhibition, Samurai, which challenges centuries of misconceptions to reveal the historic reality behind the mask. And tonight we will witness a conversation between Professor Oleg Benesch, head of our history department here at the university, and Dr Rosina Buckland, curator from the British Museum, co-authors of the accompanying publication to the exhibition. And I've seen many of you already buying books from our independent booksellers in the foyer, so there will be an opportunity to buy them after the event as well. They will discuss how the exhibition interrogates the stereotype, moving beyond the battlefield to explore the people behind the armour. They will discuss the stories of the stunning selection of objects from international collections, including weaponry, intricate armour, delicate paintings, and immersive contemporary digital media, tracing the samurai's dramatic evolution throughout eras and centuries. I must confess, on a personal note, I am very touched that I get to introduce Rosina today and share this conversation, as our paths have crossed many years ago when Rosina was conducting research on Japanese shunga prints for her brilliant exhibition and conference. Back then, I worked as a curator of Japanese art in the National Museum in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and when an email arrived from the Rosina Buckland from the British Museum, I felt positively starstruck. So it's a huge honor for me to be standing here today, and a feeling of a kind of a full circle moment to be introducing Rosina and Oleg's brilliant exhibition and publication today. Rosina and Oleg will now enter into a creative conversation. I won't be intervening because they are a well-oiled machine. They are basically two superstars on a tour, grand tour around the country, celebrating the exhibition. So this is part of, I had to hold all the paparazzi away because they are real superstars, and it's wonderful that we have them here tonight. Towards the end of the event, I will rejoin Oleg and Rosina, and I will conduct some questions and answers from the audience. So if you are thoroughly fascinated, which you definitely will be, feel free to write down your questions, and we will allocate some time for your questions towards the end of the event. And then, not only that you can buy a book today, as I mentioned, but you will be able to get it signed as well, with love from Oleg and Rosina, so absolutely special opportunity tonight. So there's a lot to look forward to today. So without further ado, let's get started and give it up for Rosina and Oleg.
Good evening. Thank you all very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is the first stop on our nationwide tour.
Yeah.
Not actually aware of any other. Well, maybe we've got one in June. But it's been fantastic to see how much interest there's been in the exhibition. We've been selling out on a lot of the days it's been open so far since the beginning of this month. Very good press reviews, some 5-star reviews was hugely rewarding to see when it opened, and lots of follow-up. It seems to be self-generating, that the more the media pay attention to it, the more others follow. So Oleg and I have been working on this for maybe 4 years now, and it's tremendous to have this exhibition finally delivered and to be able to share it with people. I started on the project more than 6 years ago now with this concept of the samurai because it is so well known as a word, and people think they know what it means, but there's this possibility to play with the known and the unknown, the myth and the reality. The word conjures up, the concept conjures up an image of a formidable warrior, a man usually, holding a sword, possessing ideals of courage, honour, self-sacrifice and loyalty. But there's little understanding of the historical reality of the people we call samurai, and we'll get into why we call them samurai, but that's not what they call themselves. And the wide variety of roles they played across the centuries. This is 800 to 1,000 years of existence and changing identities. and the many ways they represented themselves and were depicted by others, even long after they had disappeared. So it's the first exhibition, I hope, to examine critically the stereotype by exploring the many aspects of the lived reality and the history, the long history of representation. And we start the exhibition with what people expect. The poster for the exhibition, the front cover of the book, is this iconic image of the armour, the embodied figure of the samurai warrior. And this is a very splendid suit. It's the media have picked up on the way that I describe it as an assemblage, but most suits of armour are an assemblage in some sense. The cuirass of this piece is dated, well, I should start with the helmet, which is usually the oldest part of a suit of armour. The helmet is dated 1519 by a known armourer, and then the cuirass is dated 1696. They're both signed and dated. And these are the heirloom parts that get handed down generation after generation, the robust metal parts, and then the textile is more perishable, and that gets replaced over the centuries. But it's a very high status piece. This was possibly for a samurai lord, maybe put together in the 18th, early 19th century. But I say that there are two surprises for this suit, and it's why I foregrounded at the beginning of the exhibition. One is that it was probably never worn. This is a time of peace. People imagine the samurai walking around in their suits of armour, but they had no occasion to. It was a long period of peace from 1615 onwards. So this is ceremonial, it's for show, it's a status symbol. And the second surprise is how international it is in its elements. Particularly this cuirass is modelled on a Portuguese musketeer's cuirass of the 16th century. So immediately allows us to talk about the international influences on the samurai, and then the corollary to that is that there's a lot of international impact of the samurai right up to the present day. I could say more about this suit of armour. It's from the Mori clan down in southwest Japan, who were very important historically. But I think it's time now to hand over to Oleg to talk about the origins. Oh, no, it's not, because I was going to tell you the messages. Yeah. I'm craning over my neck, excuse me. Craning over my shoulder. So this is to lay out for you what the exhibition is trying to explain. That it has the concept of the samurai has its origins in reality, with a warrior clans that took power in the 1100s, and Oleg will talk a little bit more about the very early origins, very early aspects of that. One thing I keep emphasizing as I'm giving tours of the exhibition is that culture has always been equally important to the military skill. It's not just something that develops later. It's there in the Middle Ages. It comes from Chinese thought that you have to prove your worthiness to rule through culture. Then this long period of peace I just mentioned from 1615 to 1868, when samurai were forming the government basically in all of the administrative, judicial, peacekeeping roles. They were fixed as a social class during this period, really for the first time, and that means that half of them were women. And then in the late 1800s, during the process of modernization, society was reorganized, the class was abolished, and this myth of the way of the samurai is developed and co-opted, and in the early 20th century, it's used in the service of militarism and colonial expansion, and Oleg will talk more about that. And then in post-war Japan, the image of the samurai has been revisited, reimagined, rehabilitated and reimagined, and then spread across the world, repurposed for new values. And then, as I mentioned, there's this tremendous international story to be told through the samurai history and then even in the afterlife. Right, now for Oleg.
Great, no, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to talk through some of our kind of favorite objects and images and things from the exhibition, which is broadly chronologically how we're going to proceed. I'd like to start with this small snapshot of a scroll, an illustrated tale of the latter 3-year war, which took place from 1083 to 1087, roughly. This is a copy from the 1790s, which is, quite a bit later than this conflict. But one thing around the scrolls we look at, this is kind of the earliest period, the 11th century, when we start looking at what becomes recognizably the samurai. And we see these figures here in this scroll who are fighting, wearing their kind of armor. We see their arrows on their backs. And one of the things I would highlight here is, this one here, who's kind of a bit of a pincushion with all of these arrows sticking in him, is the centrality of the bow and arrow. I mean, these early warriors, this is all about mounted archery. And these were often kind of the most famous battles in early Japanese kind of samurai history, if we're talking about the 11th, 12th centuries, even into the 13th century. They're often fought by, what are often dozens or hundreds of kind of mounted archers. These are often quite small bands. And this kind of mounted archery, these are very elite. This is a very skilled practice. This is very expensive. These armors that they're wearing, I mean, they're huge armors with these kind of huge pads. They're very elaborate as well, how they kind of move, that you can fire a bow and arrow from it. They're constructed by kind of lamellar sheets, usually of either iron or leather being a bit lighter, that would then have lacquer over it, and they'd be woven together very intricately. And these earlier armors are incredibly rare now and incredibly valuable. We have one of them from the Museum of Liverpool in the exhibition, but these ones from this very early period are very interesting. But one of the things that I then highlight again is the centrality of the bow and arrow. We can see all the warriors are carrying a sword. They have a sword, but they're not really using it, and never is the sword actually kind of essential.
He's using it.
Battlefield weapon. Oh, he's using it to
another purpose.
To decapitate someone. That's kind of what you would use
carry
it for.
The head.
Yeah, to kind of carry a head, to decapitate people. You wouldn't actually be fighting with swords. We have a record from the 14th century where probably more people on the battlefield were killed by rocks than by swords at that time. So, but this is kind of where the myth and the representation begins. So.
As I mentioned, warriors have to be equally proficient or in command of cultural skills. They have to transmute military power into legitimacy through culture. The warrior bands had wrested power away from the imperial system in 1185, but the imperial court continues, and there's this parallel structure throughout the rest of Japanese history, and of course the imperial institution survives to this day, but it takes on a legitimizing role purely. The term shogun, which is this generalissimo meaning, which is given in 1185 to the first military leader of the whole of Japan. I won't call it a nation at that point. The title shogun is bestowed by the emperor, so you have to seek legitimization from the imperial court. So the warriors aspired to be like courtiers, to dress like them, to behave like them, and they were engaged in many cultural pursuits as part of this, and forms that they developed distinct to their class, like no theatre, tea practice, but there's also literature, poetry, and music. It was particularly the Ashikaga shogunate that was renowned for its cultural achievements, its cultural pursuits. That was established in 1336, and it returned to Kyoto, the imperial capital. The first shogunate government had kind of placed itself separately off in eastern Japan. The Ashikaga returned to Kyoto, and Ashikaga Yoshimasa, in particular the 8th shogun, was renowned for his collecting activities and innovations in architecture, visual arts, and theatre. Relations have been re-established during this time with Ming China, and the latest cultural trends were imported and adapted to a Japanese aesthetic. What you're seeing here is a portrait of the 13th shogun, so a few generations later, Ashikaga Yoshiteru, and illustrating this self-presentation of the samurai as a cultured layperson rather than a warrior. And it was created for the 13th annual observance of his death. And portraits during this period are often memorial objects rather than for use during life. And that's a detail there just to show you the delicacy of the painting. This is on silk. And he's wearing an orange gauze robe, so a translucent silk robe called a hitatare, very much a court robe, over white and orange silk robe. And this is an important cultural property. It has an official designation from the Japanese government, which is just below the national treasure level. So it had to have special permission to be shown outside Japan, and it's the first time it's ever come to the UK. So I will hand back to Oleg for the next part of the story.
Which, I mean, this object maybe looks a little less spectacular than some of the others at first glance. And this is a karatsu-ware tea bowl, which is from the 17th century, but we have a few from 16th century as well. And this quite simple object, it speaks to a few different things that are going on here. One of these is the appreciation for high culture, and especially Chinese and Korean culture amongst many of the samurai at the time, and especially getting into the late 15th and into the 16th centuries. And so tea ceremony, for example, is very important to many of the samurai. Chinese ink painting as well. If we think about also poetry, I mean, a lot of the things that we kind of associate with Chinese high culture at the time, often associated with Zen Buddhism as well, are kind of represented. They're very highly valued, and especially this sort of Korean tea vessel is incredibly highly valued. It also speaks to the kind of international connections that the samurai have from the very start. We didn't really touch on it, but in the 13th century, Japan is twice invaded by the Mongols. Both times is able to repel these Mongol invasions. There's constant interchange with the continent. But then what we have in the 1590s is a warlord who's unified Japan at that point, called Toyotomi Hideyoshi, decides to actually invade the continent. He wants to conquer China and Korea. He ends up only making it into Korea. It's an absolutely devastating invasion of Korea. It's absolutely horrific what goes on in Korea at that time. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people are killed. Tens of thousands are actually then abducted and forcibly taken back to Japan. And that includes many of these Korean potters as well, who are brought back to create these tea vessels for kind of the rulers of Japan at that time. And Karatsu is a town in southwestern Japan where many of these Korean potters ended up settling. So, you know, this is part of the other side of this story. I mean, there's some incredible brutality here. And the invasions of Korea are very interesting also for historians because they kind of tell us what it's like. It's almost an outside view of what the samurai are doing, because we have a lot of accounts within Japan where the samurai behavior is, I mean, I don't know if I'd call it normalized, but when they go to Korea, people in Korea just have no idea of you know, the horrors that have kind of befallen them. And I mean, it's incredibly violent. There are, quite famous now, a few what are called nose mounds in Japan, where essentially noses were brought back by the samurai to essentially demonstrate how many people they had killed. That was kind of, they were given quotas of people to kill, and they were bringing people back, or they were bringing noses back as proof of that, because they were more portable, kind of pickled in brine, brought back to Japan. One thing that's evident is that many people weren't actually killed, but their noses were cut off, and there are accounts of people walking around with no noses at this time, because essentially the samurai just needed to fulfill these quotas. And so it's this sorts of violence which is kind of behind a lot of these beautiful objects as well, that we can't really be forgotten.
Now for something completely different. So the 1500s, as Oleg describes, have these rich and complex international contacts by the Japanese, brutal explorations, expeditions onto the continent, but also Europeans coming into Japan, and the cultural stream from China, and then Europeans coming into Japan for trade and for missionary activities. The Portuguese arrived in Japan in 1543, bringing guns, matchlock guns, and the technology was widely adopted and was decisive in battles of the period. So we touch on that in the exhibition, how that impacts on armour as well. But this inevitably led to a fear of domination by the Western colonial powers. The leaders in Japan knew what was happening on the continent, and they desired the trade, but feared the influence of the West and of the Catholic Church, and particularly the Pope. The allegiance to the Pope was viewed with suspicion. And there were thousands of converts to Christianity in Japan at the time, including many many lords who compelled some of their followers to convert, others converted for genuine reasons of faith. But after these, or given these successes, the Jesuit visitor to Japan, the leader of the Jesuit mission, Alessandro Valignano, conceived of sending an embassy to the Vatican, which was sponsored by 3 of the Christian daimyo, and he was basically wanting to announce, wanting to prove the successes that they'd had in Japan. And this young man, Ito Mancho, was chosen as leader of the group. He was only 13 years old when it departed in 1583. So he was about 15 years old when they finally arrived. They travelled via Macau, Madagascar, Goa, and Lisbon, on to Madrid, and then finally Rome, arriving in spring 1585. Ito was given the title of an Italian nobleman, the Cavalier of the Golden Spur, Cavaliere di Sperondoro. And then on the return journey through Venice, his portrait was painted by Domenico Tintoretto as a papal commission and survived. So we were thrilled to get this and a similar portrait from 30 years later of another Christian mission that made it to the Vatican. So this is a samurai youth, but perhaps not what people would expect from a samurai.
Yeah, the rough never made it back to Japan, unfortunately.
Sadly.
Yeah. Let's see if, so what we have at this time is shortly after these missions to Europe as well, and Christianity, and also due to concerns about the spread of Christianity, the shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate that kind of seizes power in 1600, end up kind of closing the country off in a lot of ways. There's still quite a bit of trade and things going on, but they're especially concerned about the Europeans, and they really kind of restrict any kind of interaction with the West. And one thing we have after 1600 as well is we have, as Rosina kind of mentioned, we have 250 years of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, essentially from about 1600-ish until the 1860s. And during this time, the country, now the samurai become a hereditary class. They are still warriors. They have to kind of give their guns up because those things are dangerous, but they're allowed to keep their swords. So they all have 2 swords now as a symbol of their status. But there's no more warfare during this period, and they largely become kind of bureaucrats, administrators. They have to take up different roles. And that's one thing I really like about this print by Katsushika Hokusai from the 1840s, and it's a picture of land surveyors. So here we have some samurai engaged in their job of surveying land. Here's a close-up of them kind of measuring land. And this woodblock print was essentially commissioned to celebrate a couple new surveyors qualifying, having passed the exams, becoming surveyors. You can see they're all carrying their swords. They have their 2 swords, as you need to carry as a samurai. But you're not going to do anything with those aside from, they get in the way every now and then as you're trying to, hold the equipment and do this and that. But this really kind of shows this transition to this period of peace, and the samurai, while ostensibly, still having military ranks, and the shogun, this great generalissimo kind of ruling the country, they are very much kind of following kind of these more mundane professions, I guess. But one thing I'd also mention is, while they are very much administrators here, and Rosina touched on this, they've always been administrators, always had to administrate things. So already from the 11th and 12th centuries, when they're kind of out in the countryside administering territories on behalf of the imperial court, they're having to calculate, how much grain they're getting, how much yield they're getting, how many people they have to deal with. So they've always have had to administrate, and now it's just kind of become a bit more formalized and nationalized, and then I think feeds into the modern Japanese bureaucracy as well.
So as I mentioned, during this long period, the samurai were established as a class. We haven't got onto terminology, we'll probably talk about that later, but they're known as the bushi, or the bukkei, or the military households, because society is organized by household. You're not individuals within society, you are always part of a household. And half of that class, half of every class, is composed of women. There are many ranks within the samurai class, is another thing to emphasize. So people say to me, what would they have done? And my answer is often, it depends on what rank you are within samurai. If you're at the top and you've got a pretty decent income assigned to you by the government, this government stipend, you're going to have a nice, comfortable life. But if you're at the bottom of the samurai hierarchy, life's going to be a lot tougher. And then the samurai were receiving these government stipends in rice. It had to be converted into cash. They're often disadvantaged by that. And sometimes the other classes have more money than the samurai, so it becomes purely about the advantage of status. But the women make up half of this class. Their roles are very different from the men. The men are acting out in the public sphere. The women are operating in the domestic sphere. They're running the household, which could be a large operation with tens of people employed, tens and tens of retainers, something like a small business. They have to host events. They have to provision the household. They have to host visits and organize those kind of entertaining occasions. And they have to educate the children, different requirements for boys and for girls. In earlier times, the women had performed a similar role. When husbands were away, they would be in charge of the household. Sometimes there would be a defensive aspect to that, but in this long period of peace, they don't have that requirement anymore. We have this palanquin in the exhibition on loan from the Victoria and Albert Museum. There's not many of these that I've come across in Europe, but this we know is from a wedding procession because it has the pairing of two family crests. One is of the ruling Tokugawa family, but there were several branches of this, so it doesn't necessarily mean the main family. And then the Hosokawa family from southwest Japan. And we think the bride is from the Hosokawa because the crest is repeated on the windows. And we don't have the lady inside in the exhibition, so I've had quite a few questions of how would you travel in it, but I think it's clear from that photograph. You are seated with your legs tucked underneath you in normal Japanese seating position on a cushion, and there's a couple of armrests a little bit further back. And it's got beautiful painting on the interior all the way around the walls for the occupant to look at. And that's how a high-ranking lady would have travelled around the city, and she wouldn't be seen.
Now we have a print of some excitement here, the treasury of loyal retainers, the 47 samurai. This is kind of one of the most famous stories we have about the samurai, which I mean I've heard it described as kind of Japan's national narrative. There was a film with Keanu Reeves about 12 years ago, I think called 47 Ronin, which I don't know how much of an impact that made at the time. But it's essentially there's an incident in the very early 1700s where a lord from Western Japan is in Edo Castle visiting the shogun. We don't know exactly what happened there, but there was kind of a dispute between him and another lord. He draws his sword and tries to kill this other lord. He fails, and then he's condemned to death by the shogun. Needs to commit suicide. And then his domain is seized and disbanded. All his retainers are kind of spread out. And over the next 2 years, 47 of these kind of retainers end up plotting to then take vengeance for their lord. And they go and they essentially attack the mansion where the person who they believe is responsible for the death of their lord lives. And they end up killing him and avenging the death of their lord. They then sit there and they wait for justice. They wait for the shogun's kind of troops to arrive. They are arrested, and they are also condemned to death. It's a really dramatic story. Within a couple of years, we've got all sorts of plays, we've got books, we've got narratives, all sorts of things about this incident. They're all set in like hundreds of years earlier. All these narratives are very heavily fictionalized because there's very strict censorship of this time. At this time, you're not allowed to talk about contemporary politics. So they have to say, oh, well, this took place like in the 12th century, and yeah, with all these different names and different people. Now, this really gets portrayed. It's a great story. I mean, there's all these different dramatic things, but it really gets portrayed often as like really emblematic of the samurai, that their lord is killed and therefore they take this lethal vengeance even though they know they're all going to die. Again, this is a century into this period of peace, and the other thing to highlight is that this is a massive outlier. I mean, this is the only incident we have of this type during this time, which is one reason there is so much hype around it and why it is so interesting, because it's not the sort of thing that happens. People don't take vengeance for their lord being killed. We talk about, because it's a period of peace, there's very little danger of anything happening to your lord. So you can say all sorts of things about loyalty, but ultimately people are going to retire to a temple or something else. It's really easy to say things. But it becomes such a popular thing. These figures are almost always depicted then in these kind of black and white outfits by various different artists. We can see this one, this print is made 150 years after the actual incident. And there's still a lot of kabuki plays and other things based on this. The black and white supposedly is due to symbolize them toiling day and night for 2 years and biding their time until being able to take this lethal vengeance. But it really is a massive outlier.
So the waters around Japan are troubled and full of dangers. From 1820s onwards, really, there are Russian and American ships circling, wanting access for trade, for provisioning, for the whaling industry primarily. And the pressure continues until 1853, when the Americans turn up with steamships, armoured steamships, laden with guns, and serve an ultimatum. Japan has controlled borders. It's had this extensive trade with China all the way through, a lesser trade with the Netherlands, but there's been no official contact with any other Western nations. So America is smashing the doors open and promises to come back, and in 6 months' time, 6 months later, it does return. And the samurai are the administrators, as Oleg explained. They are the diplomats. They have to undertake the negotiations with the American sailors and with Commodore Matthew Perry leading this mission. The Americans force the signing of a treaty, and then this is followed by treaties with 4 other nations. And so we're looking in the exhibition at how this destabilizes the political regime. There ensues a lot of debate and a lot of disagreement, friction between factions within Japan, or factions develop that are then advocating different approaches to how these foreigners should be dealt with. Should they be expelled? Should they be admitted under some kind of controlled system? And it's felt there's a growing feeling that the shogunate is not coping with this situation. And through the 1860s, the battles, the retaliations by the shogunate against rebellious clans continue. And I included a detail there, a section of a very long hand scroll, about 20 meters, showing the 2 samurai clans that were on a kind of rotating duty to guard the shores, the coastline, and this is the Americans arriving on the shore. But to fast forward, these tensions, armed battles within Japan eventually lead to the collapse of the shogunate and the resignation of the shogun in 1867, followed by the creation of a new government by the samurai themselves in 1868. And I should just say this is a typical kind of recording, hand scroll painting record that would have been created for all diplomatic missions, because Japan was carrying on diplomatic relations with the Ryukyu Kingdom, today's Okinawa Prefecture, and with Korea. So this is probably for one of the lords of the clans that was charged with the kind of defense duty at that time.
And as Rosina mentioned, this kind of heralds then the end of the samurai, so to speak. Some of them do go into government, but they give up this kind of status as samurai. And this is something that, from 1868, from the period of the Meiji Restoration, the restoration of imperial power, the samurai gradually start losing their various privileges. First their stipends, their status, then in 1876, essentially, so exactly 150 years ago, they lose the right to wear swords as well. And a lot of them are really struggling now. They lose their stipends and things. They're struggling to get by, adjusting to the new order. There's a new imperial army, which has modern guns, modern Western weapons, Western uniforms, Western training, and it's made of conscripts who are mainly peasants, not samurai. So a lot of samurai who are struggling to adapt to the new order, and then essentially rebel. There's a series of rebellions in the 1870s, and the largest one is in 1877, called the Satsuma Rebellion in southwestern Japan. This is what's so heavily fictionalized in the film The Last Samurai, if people have seen that. It's very heavily fictionalized. Tom Cruise wasn't actually there. But it's very interesting when we see this woodblock print, which is made at the time in Tokyo. So again, this is hundreds of miles away from the actual battle going on. But one of the things we can see in this woodblock print, we have the castle in the background, which actually had burned down by this point, but it's still there in the woodblock print. It was also black, not white, details. But what we have here is on the left, we can kind of see the rebels, the samurai with their swords and halberds and things. And then on the right, we see the Imperial Army with guns and kind of modern uniforms and things. And also, if you watch the film, The Last Samurai, you know, it is this kind of romantic story of the samurai and with their swords, you know, against the Gatling guns and the modern weapons. I mean, that's ahistorical in the sense that the samurai were not fools. They were not taking swords to a gunfight. Both sides had modern weapons. Both sides had guns. But what we see in this woodblock print is that actually at the time, as soon as it became clear, which was fairly early on, that the rebels were going to lose, they started romanticizing them. And they started portraying them not with guns, but with swords, and portraying them as like kind of these heroes of a traditional kind of an older order that was already gone. So it's ahistorical, but it also makes Tom Cruise's Last Samurai seem a lot more kind of reflective of discourses of the time than I'd given it credit for.
So after this regime change, the laws change, foreigners are admitted, and many foreign tourists begin to visit Japan, the precursors of the millions who are visiting today. And they were captivated by the image of the samurai, by the idea of a medieval or feudal society that they could still witness somehow. It was only a few years since the government had changed. And as this old world disappeared, it had even greater appeal. Many families, many samurai families, were having to sell off their armour and other possessions, which were snapped up by Westerners. This is a suit of armour on a Japanese mannequin. It was called a living doll, literally, an ikiningyo, probably used in fun fairs, mise en scène that were popular in the mid-1800s, but then it's being used as a model for armour that's sold off, shipped to the UK, and was owned by the architect William Burgess, who's best known for Cardiff Castle. It was displayed, he had it displayed in his armoury within his house in Holland Park. And we know that he had mostly Western and Islamic armour and just this one suit of Japanese armour, which was then shown at the Royal Archaeological Institute in 1880 and donated to bequeathed to the British Museum the following year. So we're using it as an example of the beginnings of this European fantasy of what the samurai are and what they can represent. And we're very pleased to have it on display. We know it was on display in the late 1800s in the ethnographic gallery soon after it was donated, but it hasn't been on display for a long time, so it's had extensive conservation, was put back on its mannequin, and now is looking very splendid in the exhibition.
And we can see some more of this kind of European-Japanese interaction at this time in this object here, this sword, because one of the things we have, as I mentioned, you know, the samurai class is effectively abolished. We have a modern imperial army after 1877. You know, there's no more kind of resistance to that. But one of the things is the modern army it brings in European sabers. You know, they want nothing to do with the samurai anymore. They have guns. They have European-style sabers. It's very much seeing the samurai as kind of embarrassing relics of the feudal past. I mean, that's really how they're being seen in the 1870s and 1880s more broadly in Japan. And so as part of this westernizing move, you get away from all of those things. What happens around kind of the turn of the century, around 1900, especially around 1904-05, when Japan defeats Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, is you start seeing a celebration and a rediscovery of earlier samurai kind of symbols and ideals, and people kind of reinventing. This is when the way of the samurai, or Bushido, really kind of gets invented and becomes a global thing. And this is when samurai, for the first time, become a global icon, is in the first years of the 20th century. And this item here is quite interesting because this is a sword that is, you know, produced there around the time of the First World War, which has, you know, it's a European saber on the outside, but you take it out and it's actually a several centuries-year-old kind of Japanese katana on the inside. So we see this kind of merge between these two, that, you know, see kind of the European saber and the Japanese blade. One thing that then happens after this is in the 1930s, you see a shift where the military actually goes all the way back to samurai swords. So in the early 1930s, they create a new military sword, which is, it's machine forged, they're cheaply made, they're mass produced, but they are a Japanese katana style sword. And that's what's given to all officers of the Japanese military then, the Army and Navy, in the 1930s, to show partly how that samurai spirit, that idea is being used as an ideology in that time.
And then we come to the post-war. Again, something completely different. We have a reflection by 3 men who were combatants in the war, who are also artists, just to have a moment to pause and reflect on the war. But then we welcome visitors to the final section of the exhibition with the unmistakable figure of Darth Vader. And this allows us to explore the layers of cultural reference that occurred in the post-war period. There was a 7-year period during the US occupation of Japan following Japan's defeat in the war, in the Second World War, a 7-year period of occupation when militaristic images or images associated with militarism were banned, so all representations of the samurai were banned during this period. But after the occupation ended in 1952, there was a revisiting, a reconsideration of the samurai, particularly by filmmakers such as Akira Kurosawa, who was producing more nuanced considerations of samurai figures, not always heroes, not always even real samurai, but just giving us a range of different types. The most famous is Seven Samurai, and these were taken up by Western film directors, such as Magnificent Seven by Sergio Leone. Kurosawa's Yojimbo became Fistful of Dollars, again by Sergio Leone. But then most famously, George Lucas was aware of the plot of Kurosawa's film Hidden Fortress, which has 2 bumbling characters, or a general and 2 bumbling characters who have to escort a princess across enemy territory while guarding precious property. And there's a duel between the good general and a scarred rival. And so we end up at Star Wars. And it was particularly with the costume, it's the helmet that I was interested in getting this iconic figure. Because we know that George Lucas, instructed his costume designer to get him a big helmet, something like a samurai helmet. And so we end up with this incredibly distinctive shape with a flared neck guard of the traditional Japanese helmet. And then this has been taken up in various iterations, including by the artist Ishikawa Masumi, who's done other pop culture figures like David Bowie. He designs woodblock prints, which are then created by artisans. And this was an officially licensed image, licensed by Lucasfilm. And then beyond that, we also have Kylo Ren's helmet in the exhibition as well. So just iteration after iteration, both in Japan and outside Japan.
And I mentioned earlier that, around the time of the Russo-Japanese Wars from 1904-05, this is the first time that kind of the samurai really become a global icon. And I say it's the first time because I think we're kind of in the middle of the second time. I mean, in kind of probably starting in the 1990s onward, that people can really recognize and appropriate the samurai and use it for different things. So, when Kurosawa's films come out, those are then remade as Westerns or remade as Star Wars. So they take them away from kind of samurai to make something else. But now we have things like, I mentioned The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, which is, I think, an important kind of thing here. We have the Keanu Reeves film, which doesn't do so well. But then we have things like 2020, this game Ghost of Tsushima that came out. Last year we had Ghost of Yotei as a sequel. I mean, they're amazing games. They both have like a Kurosawa mode, which is black and white, so you can play it like it's Kurosawa. A lot of people may be familiar with the Shogun series that came out, the remake, and the new one of those is coming out, I think is being made right now. We had the game Assassin's Creed Shadows, which came out last year. That's been a really big thing. And all of those things that I've just mentioned, one thing they all have in common is none of them were made in Japan. Like these are all American studios, French studios, Canadian studios. These are all, they're bringing in Japanese advisors and this and that, but most of these things, or all of those things, are made by overseas studios. And that really kind of reflects how the samurai have become this kind of global icon that everyone recognizes and people want to kind of produce samurai content. And it's something that can kind of be appropriated and different things done with it. And so, you know, we're in the midst of kind of the second phase of the samurai as a global icon. I mean, even the British Museum is doing shows about it.
Samurai boom. Again, for something completely different. We talk in the exhibition about samurai being used for national identity, in sports teams, in local identity, in festivals. But we also have quite a few examples of contemporary artists using the samurai figure, the samurai icon, including this, and fashion as well, I should say, for fashion looks. But this is the contemporary artist Noguchi Tetsuya, who is primarily interested in armour. He's done a lot of historical research on armour and makes these meticulously crafted miniature versions of armour worn by often sad-looking little figures. This one's, I think he's about 45 centimetres high, to give you an idea. But he places these figures in incongruous settings, using anachronism to jolt our attention. He does paintings as well that are in 16th century Japanese style or 16th century Dutch style. We have a painting in the exhibition in the style of Rembrandt. But he's just jolting us awake by these strange juxtapositions, saying something about the stresses of modern life, I think, perhaps a desire for playfulness. Many of these samurai figures look like stressed businessmen, bureaucrats. He likens them to civil servants sometimes. They just need to go away and do something silly and have some fun, do something playful. And I visited Noguchi's studio back in November, accompanying a couple of journalists to some significant sites in Japan, and we asked him the inspiration, and he said that he'd researched what the best-selling object in the British Museum shop was. And it's the rubber ducks in the form of Cleopatra, Roman soldier, Greek god, and samurai. So this is a nod to the British Museum, apparently, and he's got his bow and his quiver of arrows. He's a true medieval samurai.
And I mean, one thing I'd like to just kind of highlight at the end is that, I mean, one thing, when we've been working on this now for quite a few years, and we've been working with quite a large team of people around the world, kind of mainly experts on Japanese history, but also kind of different regions of the world. So this whole thing has also been part of a large research project that has fed into the exhibition, and people who see the exhibition book, there are columns from many of the contributors in there about specific objects, about specific contexts and things. But we also have, we've been working very closely with the International Center for Japanese Studies in Kyoto, also called Nichibunken. They have a beautiful library up top there. And their flagship journal, Japan Review, and we're putting out 2 special issues of Japan Review. The first one's coming out in March, and the next one hopefully towards the end of the year, with 22 kind of contributions, all open access, which will make people happy.
Detail, don't we,
and we have a little detail, and there's some of the titles of things here, but also we managed to get Noguchi Tetsuya to give us permission to use one of his paintings for the journal. So you can see the samurai warlord standing there looking at a balloon that's kind of floating away from them there in the middle. Again, very irreverent. But there's a lot of new research that's gone into this project. So earlier when I was mentioning that woodblock print and how the Last Samurai film around that time actually does reflect discourses at that time, that even though the rebels did have guns, they're being depicted as having swords, and that at the time people are actually looking at this kind of anachronistic traditionalist thing. This is a research article that's in here by Mark Ravina. This is something that he discovered by looking at woodblock prints, kind of the newsprints from that time, and really discovered that. So there's a lot of kind of new research that's going into this. We have a symposium in London in April, and then another one in Kyoto this November to kind of take that forward a bit and talk a little bit more about that, and also take a lot of this to Japan. So
there's a book to buy.
And there's also a book, apparently. Yeah. We don't get any royalties from that. Just yeah. So yeah.
Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. Please give it up. That was such a brilliant conversation. And we are now opening the floor to questions from the audience. So please, lady in the white, please. Oh, we do have lovely assistants running around with a microphone. There you go.
Hi, thank you. It was very interesting. I have to think back to the 47 people because it's basically the culture of samurai is about being gentlemen and being very sort of proper and whatever. What made them do that? Was it because they loved the leader so much, or was it some other? What caused it? If you say that it was the only occasion in the history, there must have been some very strong reason why that happened. What was it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something that's occupied people for 300 years now, is trying to figure out exactly what they were doing. And there's been a lot of things that have kind of been given as reasons. One thing is that they were trying to, they'd essentially been made unemployed. They're now masters of the samurai, and that essentially by doing this kind of great deed, this sensational deed, they would then be given different employment. That people would hire them, people would want them, and they would get new jobs. Well, some of them say that that's what they went into it for. It's not clear that they thought they were going to die there, because it was, theoretically, there were situations where it would be legal to take lethal vengeance. Like if someone had killed your father, you could get permission from the shogunate and then avenge his killing. That was something you could do, but you had to get permission. You had to have the paperwork. These guys didn't have the paperwork. There was a lot of paperwork in early modern Japan.
And I think it's complicated to assume that there's some aim to be a gentleman, because that's a much later idea.
And that's, yeah, and one thing which is really interesting about this, and this also gets this issue of motivations, is in all the discussions we have of this incident afterward, people are not necessarily talking about it and saying, oh, well, this is in line with a way of the samurai, or this is against a way of the samurai. People aren't talking about it that way. What they're talking about it generally is they're talking about it using ancient Chinese examples. They're talking about the Confucian classics, because that is the reference point for people in Japan, Korea, also Vietnam at this point, in China. They're looking at these ancient Chinese kind of examples and heroes and sages, and they're saying, oh, well, this Chinese hero would not have done that, and so or Confucius says this, so they shouldn't have done that. Or Mencius says this, so they should have done that. And there's all sorts of debates. There's no agreement about this at all. And so that's a really, that motivation, we have some of the things that they've written and the things that they've said, but whether that's actually why they did these things or not,
But
that's
considerable criticism, wasn't there? Because they were rebelling against the shogunate. And their ultimate loyalty should have been to the shogunate, so
yeah,
many saw them as traitors.
But there were, I think, over 300 retainers originally, so this was kind of the hard core that was left. The others went off and did something else. They became land surveyors or something.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Lovely gentleman there. 300, that's a lot.
But just as a group of retainers. I mean, you might have thousands of retainers, but
yeah.
They...
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, you can hear me. It's something that's puzzled me. I've been studying the subject myself for years, and the idea, as you discussed earlier, about the horror of the Korean invasions of the 1590s, and the wars preceding them, the civil wars, and then after the triumph of the Tokugawa, you have 250 years of peace, and it baffles me. Do you have any ideas on how this happened? How this class of the violence of the preceding era can suddenly turn into a peaceful era?
I don't think it's sudden is the point, isn't it?
It's just incredible. You got a country at peace for 250 years. That's come out of that. It just baffles me how this happened.
Yes, so I think there's a couple of things going. One of them is that it as Rosina just mentioned, it's not that fast. It actually, I mean, there are uprisings. It's only 1615 that finally the last of the previous regimes kind of remnants are kind of put down. Then there's still kind of rebellions even in the late 1630s. So it takes quite a while. There's also quite a bit of just general violence because you have a lot of effectively veterans of the conflicts of the 16th century around still. So it's still quite a rough place for the first decades of the 17th century. It's a gradual transition. But one of the reasons that's given for the invasions of Korea actually in the 1590s is to get all these people out of the country. That, I mean,
Give them something to do.
Give them something to do, who have been fighting in these civil wars now for decades. And what do you do with them? And it's like, well, actually, let's go invade Korea. And actually, the same thing happens around 1870, when, again, we had a lot of internal conflict in Japan in the 1860s. We now have a new government. We have all these people who've been involved in different conflicts between clans. Let's invade Korea. And there's a huge debate around that time in the early 1870s about whether or not to do this. And they ultimately decide not to, fortunately for Korea, essentially because they're afraid that it would just kind of give the Western powers an excuse to intervene and colonize Japan. And that's the reason they don't do it. But in a sense, these invasions outside is a way of getting all of, or as much of the violence as possible out of the country and kind of paving the road for peace, if that makes sense, that being one of the narratives.
But there are economic aspects as well. I would never feel comfortable saying there's anything to do with character or anything innate going on here that changes, because it's to do with economic prosperity and I think urbanization to a large extent. That the Edo is the largest city in the world by 1800. You've got this burgeoning city, you've got economic stability, burgeoning culture. If there is enough harvest, people can live peacefully, and then it starts breaking down again in the 1800s. And if you look at Europe as a parallel at this point, you've got the Napoleonic Wars, you've got so much conflict going on there. So Japan does have a tremendous achievement for this long period of peace. And the instability returns in the early 1800s. There are harvest failures, famines, rice riots, but you've now got the added element of the West. So the disruption is kind of, complicated by the West coming in. And it could have just carried on in Japan with civil war again, but now the West is going to control the outcome of that, or have a very controlling part in the outcome of that, and it ends up opening Japan to full trade in the 1850s.
Fantastic. Any more questions from the audience? There, gentleman over there.
Thank you. So Japan is made up of many islands. How uniform was the concept of samurai across all the different islands in Japan?
Not at all, probably, is the quick answer. You could talk about the terminology more, but because one aspect is that they're never really called samurai in any coherent way, and we've used it as a useful label for the exhibition because it's known outside Japan. It's a label that's used in the West, and Oleg can talk about the history of that and what was there in its place. But through the medieval period, there is no uniform identity for the samurai, and even in the Edo period from 1603 to 1868, it varies according to the clan. It's a federated structure. You've got the shogunate at the top, but Japan is divided into 260 domains, and the regulations and the expectations for men's roles, for women's roles, can vary according to clan. And there's a certain standardization or bringing together that happens because these lords have to come to Edo every other year for the shogun to keep an eye on them, pretty much. So you get some development of a national culture coming through that, coming together in Edo. But the terminology is interesting.
Yeah, and I think another thing to think about is what is actually Japan at these different times. I mean, now, for example, we include Hokkaido and we include Okinawa as part of Japan. I mean, Hokkaido isn't part of the conversation really until the late 19th century. And Okinawa is kind of pseudo-independent until the Ryukyu Kingdom, until also kind of late 19th century. But for a lot of these earlier periods, when the first shogunate arises in Kamakura, so kind of in the late 12th century, Kamakura is just south of Yokohama today. I mean, that is the Wild East. the court is in Kyoto, in central Japan, and Kamakura is in the middle of nowhere, and so that's why they're able to build this power base. And so the area that's Yokohama, Tokyo today, I mean, that's really kind of the edge of civilization. When you get to something like Fukushima, for example, that sort of area, I mean, that's where people kind of get sent to exile, and it's kind of like really the borderland. So even in the earlier periods, what is actually Japan? Then when we get to later periods, then there's just so much difference between just the urban-rural divide, between different territories. People in some domains will believe that, oh yeah, we have the greatest warriors. People in other domains will look down on them. There's all sorts of criticism between them. So it's incredibly diverse. And on the terminology, people will use. They won't use this word samurai, which tends to mean like to serve. In Germany or in Japanese, people will say bushi or buke usually, or musha. Or there's various terms they use. They'll often just use the rank, what someone's actually specific rank is what they'll use. For some reason, samurai gets picked up already by Europeans around 1600. We see it in texts around that time, European texts. And then in the late 19th century, when re-engagement with the West happens, Europeans are picking this term up. And suddenly, around the turn of the 20th century, people in Japan are realizing that, well, people in the West are using this term to refer to Japanese warriors, so okay, we'll maybe use it a bit too. And for those people who know Japanese, Japanese is written in 3 alphabets. There's kind of Chinese characters. There is a phonetic alphabet for Japanese words, and then there's also another phonetic alphabet that's used for foreign loan words called katakana. And the word samurai, since about the 1960s, has shifted to be used more and more, or to written more and more in the foreign loanword alphabet. So it's almost seen as a foreign word in Japan, or at least there's a recognition that it is this kind of foreign concept and maybe this global standard or this global icon. And then you see it in words like samurai blue, like blue samurai, which is the Japanese national football team, or samurai Japan, which is the baseball team. So, and these are things which are very much engaging with the world. So that's where this kind of, if you say samurai to someone now, it's a very different thing than it would have been 100 years ago, then 200 years ago, and then all the regional differences.
Fantastic. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Ben?
So you mentioned with the portrait by Tintoretto of that 3 Christian daimyo got their people together to send to Rome to say, hello, we are Christians too. I know that then Christianity was completely outlawed in Japan, and that's where the martyrs of Nagasaki were all crucified. What happened to the daimyos? Because you can't murder part of your bureaucratic class in the same way that you can just sort of make an example of, I don't know, the peasantry, but...
I think it depended. It's a very good question. And the second mission that we feature that departed in 1613 and I think returned 8 years later, and Christianity was already being prescribed by the time they got back. So you didn't get the email while you were away that, sorry, you were sent out on a Christian mission, but now it's gone, or it's being pushed out. It depends on the daimyo. I mean, some of them apostatized, went back to being non-Christian, whatever they had been before, but others fled, and we have examples of that in the research project.
Yeah, so there's, especially in Southeast Asia, there's large Japanese communities in what's now the Philippines and Thailand, and quite a few Christian daimyo essentially went to those places along with some of their followers. There's also a lot that went underground, they say. So I think they're
harder for a daimyo though.
It's harder for a daimyo, but there's, I think the number is something like supposedly 90,000 or so kind of hidden Christians in southwestern Japan who end up essentially kind of going underground with their faith. They kind of keep passing it on orally, but not having any written text. They end up essentially create what look like Buddhist figurines, but they actually have Christian significance. They have crosses hidden in lanterns and various other things. And they're able to kind of keep the faith alive as largely an oral tradition underground secretly for about 250 years until Japan opens up to Christianity again really in the 1870s. And it's really interesting when you read the accounts of kind of the first I think it's French Jesuits who are coming in again in the 1870s, and they're encountering these Japanese Christians who've been keeping things going for 250 years underground. And the things they're saying, they don't reckon. What are you saying? What is this? What are these things you're practicing? And then they realize that, oh, this is 250 years of oral transmission of a Portuguese pronunciation of this kind of, this phrase. And so, so at that point, some of these hidden Christians end up kind of converting almost back to kind of Catholicism or other forms of Christianity. And some of them just say, actually, no, we've been doing this for 250 years under pain of death. We'll just keep doing what we're doing. Thanks. So yeah, there's a lot of it that still survives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And I just have a few words that I would like to share with you. But before we do that, let's give it up for Oleg and Rosina. And
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just have a few words as well to thank to our speakers and also to all of you. I'm so glad that you could all make it to tonight's wonderful events. There were so many inspiring things in this conversation. I've just made a few notes of the things that really struck me, such as if you want to kill someone in a battle, you're more likely to succeed with a stone rather than a sword. Something I did not expect to learn tonight. Thank you for that. I thought you navigated really beautifully on a more serious note, the more kind of complex side of things, the political and religious complexities of the different eras that you explained, and it was very thoughtful of you the way you navigated some of the violence behind the artworks as well and the whole colonial context, so it was wonderful to hear a bit more about that as well. On a lighter note, I did find it oddly uplifting and satisfying that even the samurai actually ultimately became bureaucrats overpowered by admin, even before the invention of the spreadsheet. So that is very good to hear. And of course, the Darth Vader will forever stand out to me differently after what I've heard today. That's been a life-changing thing. For me, though, as the curator of the University Art Collection, tonight's event also embodies the vital connection between academic research and curatorial work, which is one of the underlying principles behind working with our art collection here on campus and also behind your exhibition. And I found it very moving that you were talking about that wonderful marrying of academic excellence and curatorial excellence, bringing together something exceptional. This important combination is really beautifully reflected here in York in our collaboration with students of history and history of art, and curating, some of whom I see in the audience today as well. How encouraging it must be for students to see a leading academic and a renowned curator joining forces to create something truly exceptional on a global scale. This exceptionality could not be achieved without the two unique skill sets, the academic and the curatorial, coming together to mutually enrich and support each other, which I believe is the very ethos of what we are trying to do here with Art on Campus here at York. So thank you so much for being such inspiring examples for us.
And my thanks on behalf of the British Museum for the support from the University of York and from Oleg Benesch in particular. All of our exhibitions have been these kind of collaborations, our major exhibitions between an academic and a university and a curator for that combination, as you said. So
fantastic.
It's been essential.
Follow in those footsteps. Now, if I've managed to whet your appetite a bit for exhibitions, before you all jump on a train and go and see Samurai, hopefully repeatedly until May, you can also enjoy another art-themed exhibition here in York. Later this week, York Art Gallery will be opening a fantastic show on Japanese woodblock prints called Making Waves, curated by Dr. Eleanor Jackson, who is an alumna of History of Art here at York and also present here tonight. So hooray for the York Art Gallery team. And this exhibition will run until August, and there is an exciting lineup of events associated with the exhibition, so do check it out, including Oleg's and Eleanor's and mine talk. So please do check it out and join us later. If you also want to expand your exhibition visits beyond Japanese art, you should definitely enjoy some art here on campus. And I just have to use this opportunity for a shameless plug for our art collection. We've just opened a new gallery at Heslington Hall, and it's showing an exhibition called New Fashions for the New Woman, curated by Professor Cordula van Weyer from History of Art and her team of undergrad students who's done an amazing job. And just tomorrow we will be installing a new exhibition by local artist Matthew Herring at the library's Fairhurst Gallery. And there are displays of art in Derwent College and Spring Lane building as part of the Art of Politics Trail. We've also opened a new display of 18th century art in the Centre for 18th Century Studies at Heslington Hall. And of course, now finally that the sun has come back, you can enjoy our outdoor sculptures. We've got 15 sculptures across Campus West and 1 on Campus East. And I'm pleased to say that Rosina has been taking around almost all of them today as part of preparing for tonight's event. It's been absolutely wonderful to see you all here, and I'm really thrilled to see so many people from beyond the university joining us for these events, bringing our shared desire for our campus to be open and welcoming for everyone. Of course, for our students and staff, but also to everyone from our beautiful city and region and beyond. And you are truly embodying that tonight. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and give it up once again for our fantastic speakers.
Thank you.